Okay, welcome to those who are joining us online for the public session of our board, which is being live streamed. It's still in COVID state, so we're not able to have members of the public in, but hopefully those who wish can tune in to see us online. Welcome to the Chief Constable, Deputy Chief Constable, and our two Assistant Chief Constables who are with us today to take the various questions that we will have. Before I hand over to the chair, just want to mention a few matters that have arisen since our September meeting, and there have been lots of things that have happened, as we know, in that period of time. As a board, we have to record our sincere condolences to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, and Simon, of course, was previously in the Met, as was Mark, so may know the parties concerned, but following the tragic murder of Sergeant Matthew Ratana last week. Particularly poignant that he lost his life just before the National Police Memorial Day. His service and commitment to the community extended far beyond the uniform he wore through his passion for rugby and coaching, and we've heard a lot about that since his passing. It's only in the face of tragic incident that people briefly get an insight of the individual behind the uniform, and we get to hear about the real difference that an officer has made to people's lives inside and outside of work. And in that field, sporting field, I also want to reference Potter Heffron, who was a police officer injured in a bomb, who, despite the life-changing injuries that he received, has returned to achieve success in his sporting passion through coaching St Paul's GAA club to county championship success for the first time. So well done to Podrick. And it's humbling, inspiring, inspirational stories like that aren't always in the public domain, but are a testimony to the contributions that officers give and make day in and day out. So we do thank you and thank all of the officers for the work that you do on our behalf. We've received a number of reports today, and indeed earlier in our session we heard from the Inspectorate report, HMIC. The Joint Inspection Report on Police Custody Arrangements has been published yesterday, and the board, as you know, Chief Constable, is fully supportive of rollout of the nurse-led healthcare pilot at Musgrave. The issues around vulnerability, drug and alcohol misuse, and people being brought into custody are not changing. And if there are issues around resourcing that need to be resolved, then we need to work through those with you to make a case to our partners who are involved. Issues around looked after children also need to be resolved quickly. On the reports around the HMI recent findings, we had detailed discussions with Matt, as I've already mentioned this morning. Broadly, we welcome that HMI's overall findings are deemed to be good and highlight programs of work already progressed, which have contributed to improving the policing service delivered. And that is a positive. Lots of the questions we received are around issues for things to change, but they're minor by comparison with the good work that's been done, and indeed the positive moves that we've already heard to enact suggestions that were made in previous years. So well done for that. There will no doubt be questions to further come from there. European exit, in respect of that, we step closer day by day, and as you rightly point out, Chief, there's a severe lack of detail around what's happening. Your assessment and updates on that will be helpful, and again, there'll be questions to come on that subject. COVID continues to be with us and will be for the foreseeable future, change how each of us live our lives on a daily basis. But policing returns to the spotlight in terms of enforcement activity, and I'm pleased that the new Executive Communications Group has been established, and it's important in terms of communication and messaging, but it's also still not clear to the public, to business and others who exactly is responsible for what. And so clarity we need to find, and I'm sure clarity you need to find as well on that subject. Board members have previously questioned you in the role of designated individuals and the necessity for delegation, as police cannot be responsible for enforcement in all areas at all times. And again, we would support you in that, seeking to ensure that everyone plays their part and it's not just all left to or expected of the police service. So perhaps you can provide us all with clarity on the current position and also outline the workings of the communications groups and spokespersons, given some media criticisms that have been around this week. Finally, it's positive to see the new initiative launched this month within roads, policing, and just this week on public transport networks. So, Chief, I'll expect to see you on the buses, not just the trains. I know you have a passion in that area. Those points having been made, ask Simon if you would refer to your report, and then we'll come to questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chair. First of all, just I think on behalf of us to respond to thank the board for the kind remarks in relation to the awful death of a colleague in London, but also the contribution that Patrick's made in terms of how he's dealt with life-changing injuries and continues to contribute to community. So that's really appreciated. I'm conscious that even in your introduction, it just reminds us of the sheer breadth of stuff that we have to wrestle with at the moment. And you talked in your opening remarks about the spotlight being under a number of things. And I think it's part of the report today before you is to try and remind members about the tempo sort of feels relentless at the moment. There's three particular issues that I think are buffeting against each other at the moment. Clearly, as you said in opening comments, the policing of COVID restrictions continues to be a matter of almost daily concern and scrutiny. Indeed, Alan's just joined us fresh from the meeting with the executive. I think, obviously, the matter of the moment seems to be the policing of the wearing of face masks. I think it's important to recognise that from what we see from both the retail sector and from TransLink, there's about 90% compliance actually with the restrictions and the desire for people to behave in that social distance space of which face masks are part. And I think maybe one of the messages to come for today is that we don't necessarily see this as a place for policing to be interrupting people's lives. Clearly, we have the 4 E's approach, and on occasions, the 3 E's, encourage and explain, should be sufficient if officers come across people not wearing a face mask. And obviously, on occasions, there'll be legitimate reasons for medical reasons, etc., while people won't. So I know it's a live issue, but actually we're here to follow the health regulations and the direction set in that context rather than turn it into a police enforcement issue. The other thing I think that's worth remembering in that space of what should policing be doing to support all of us in keeping safe and keeping the virus at bay is that when you round the clock back to March, that effectively society shut down, the amount of work that we had to do with dropped by a third, and in some cases more than that. So we were able to reorganise to effectively police the movement of people around the country when the virus was probably at its most extreme. You'll see from the report, though, now that work has turned back to pretty much normal levels. Crime is creeping up to where we'd expect it to be. Antisocial behaviour has gone up significantly, and only about a fifth of that is attributed to being COVID-related behaviour in community. So that is stretching the availability of frontline officers to do with a whole raft of stuff. And similarly, as you saw only last weekend, the policing of protests remains an issue for us. So we had a demonstration at the prison, but also a number of simultaneous protests here in the city, and that again consumes officer time at the same time as dealing with calls for help from the public and investigating crime. I'm pleased that we've had a chance to reference the HMIC report. That's clearly one of a number of bodies that holds to account. You referenced the other one in relation to custody. And I think it is a tribute to hard work of all sorts of people that sometimes you overlook the fact that there are 3 good assessments there, which puts us in a strong comparable place to the bulk of policing in England and Wales. And that's sometimes a fine balancing act because the uniqueness of the context here, we're the only armed police service in the whole of the United Kingdom, sometimes puts us out on a limb and sometimes may feel that we're a bit insular. But actually, this is the first time actually that we've gone through a moderation process without any qualification. So we're put up against our peers in another setting. So the fact that we've got 3 goods, albeit there are some areas where we've already recognised that there's things we can improve on, and probably some of them, as we may hear later, are identified already. Mark will be coordinating our response. In your report, I think for the first time, and I know it will hit the public domain later, is an infographic that tries to just point some headlines in relation to the COVID policing picture. We've nearly issued 1,000 penalty notices now through the work that you'll hear from Alan later, who continues to work really hard alongside a number of other roles to coordinate our response here. And even in the weekend gone, we visited over 350 licensed premises as part of doing our bit to make sure that people are hearing the message from the executive and also abiding by social distancing guidelines or restrictions. I think in terms of expectations, the thing that you will hear from Alan later is that the thing we have zoned in on in the last few weeks, following the medical evidence, is house parties in terms of the enforcement piece, and there are specific details in the report there. And also at the same time, we have to remember that as an organisation, we are not immune to the virus ourselves, so have practices and process in place to do when an officers or staff fall ill, but also the issue of isolation that falls out of the contact trace regime. But I think it's worth to stress that at the moment, we're quite confident in terms of our staffing levels and resilience and our adaptability to deal with this. And indeed, that was probably highlighted by the joint review we've just finished with the Garda, where we've written to you with the details of that review, that shows that actually, whilst some bits on the margins were different, there was some areas in the middle where broadly we adopted the same approach. But I think the refreshing thing was that spirit of transparency, openness, and mutual learning in the space of how we police the whole of the island of Ireland in a crisis like this, which frankly will not respect a border. One of the things that's always been at the back of people's minds, I suppose, is the effects on community and neighbourhood policing. That does manifest itself in the review, where we did take slightly different approaches for different operational reasons. But our commitment is that any degradation of neighbourhood policing in the months ahead is absolutely an option of last resort. None of us quite know over a 6-month window where the pressures of policing the virus as well as other issues will take us, but we want to preserve neighbourhood policing. I think there's a few things just to quickly highlight moving forwards before we take questions. Today, obviously, the 1st of October is Black History Month. There'll be a number of initiatives we'll be commenting on as the month goes ahead to show our support for promoting equality and tackling racism. And then on another front, Monday, the 5th of October is quite an important day for us in terms of it will signal a number of promotions to new jobs for people at Chief Superintendent and Superintendent rank right across the organisation. That will affect some of you in local district policing roles, but actually there are other roles we've created to support the momentum of change and also dealing with some of the specifics. So, for example, a new person going to support Mark, who is our Gold Commander for dealing with the EU exit. It's worth signaling as well that Hate Crime Awareness Week is creeping up on us. That will be between the 10th and 17th of October. I know it's an issue that Mark has put a huge amount of effort into, both here and indeed across the UK, given his Police Chiefs Council role. Again, signaling ahead, you kindly referenced the investment we've made in the Intercept team. I was on patrol with that earlier in the month. I haven't made it on a train yet, but that's a forthcoming attraction with the transport team. But in seriousness, that is about prepared to invest in making the movement of people around the country a safe experience, because that encourages economic growth and cohesive communities. So we recognise we have a part to play there. Also, in terms of new things, subject to some final consultation with yourselves in a fortnight's time, we are about to embark on the new uniform trial. You'll see a number of options when we bring that down in a couple of weeks' time. It'll be rolled out in 6 sites across the country for roughly 3 months. So we test both durability and officer and public reaction. And then you also made mention earlier, Chair, about the future. And I'm pleased to report that we've now had the signal from the Department of Justice that our 3 big ticket items in terms of the future, i.e. the 7,500 officers, digital policing, and the investment in new estate, are now proceeding to full business case. That doesn't mean we've yet got the money, but it's a positive sign that we're enabled to sort of move it through the bureaucracy to see where the government can invest in policing. You did mention the custody review. Obviously, that's hot off the press. Mark's got a process in place in his criminal justice parts of his portfolio to see how we address any of the areas for development. But again, it's this signal we've come a long way. That said, I think custody is an area where eventually I think we need to have some different conversations with you about the distributed nature of our custody centres. Some are small, some really don't reflect modern standards and again require investment. So that'll be an issue for future discussion. Finally, in terms of what Mark is doing, I'm sure we'll have some questions later, because sometimes it's easy to overlook the fact that the EU exit in whatever form is only a few months away now. He's now taken up the command of this issue in police speak as the goal commander. We have a new dedicated lead who'll start on Monday. And actually, from the other sort of issue of learning and governance that we've put in place, that as a senior team, we'll be operating as what we call a platinum group to give assurance to Mark's decisions from next week. I'm sure there'll be questions on this as we go through the afternoon, because clearly there are a lot of concerns about how we track people in a different environment, and equally how we move information around to keep communities safe. The analogy I'd like to try and draw upon is that rather than things stopping and heading towards a cliff, it's a bit imagining you're going backwards in time. So you're moving from Wi-Fi to a modem. So in effect, you'll still have some connectivity. It will just take a lot longer. And that's our assessment of the worst case at the moment. But clearly, as Mark will probably tell you later, we're patched into a lot of UK level working groups to try and support the negotiations so that there isn't a dramatic degradation in service. But the final thing to point out is that despite some of the optimism in other parts of our policing arena, we would welcome your support in securing the outstanding money from the Department of Justice to police the Brexit challenge. We're still 4.5 million light of what was committed. We can absorb that pressure in the short term, but clarity of what that means for us in the weeks ahead will be welcome. So thank you for the opportunity to make some quick commentary, and then we'll take questions, Chair.
Thank you, Chief Constable. You can be assured that we will speak on your behalf in terms of the additional monies that are required and provide some certainty in terms of the funders with regard to the Brexit ask. We're going to start with COVID, and we're joined by Alan Todd. Welcome, Alan. He wasn't in the previous part of our meeting, so welcome to today's session. Dolores is going to lead in this, and then John Blair also has questions in relation to this. I'm sure, Alan, when you took up the goal command for COVID, you didn't expect it to last quite this long, and there's no end in sight. But I'll ask Dolores to kick off in this area, please.
Thanks very much, and thank the Chief for his extensive report. But in relation to COVID, there's obviously a lot of public discourse in relation to particularly the policing of face coverings, which I personally think would be very challenging for police or any agency really to effectively control. But can I ask, in relation to your involvement in early discussion with the Executive Office in relation to any new regulations and restrictions, at what point have you been invited to engage, particularly around the actions then that will flow out of that around enforcement? And I just wonder too, how is it expected that there will be policing of the number of people attending each other's households? And then I want to ask around the consistency of approach of enforcement across all districts. How are we ensuring that no matter who stops you in what area, you'll get the same response from a police officer?
Thank you, Dolores. I'll touch on a few headlines, and if Alan thinks there's some gaps, I'm sure he'll jump in. I think firstly, in fairness to the broader strategic question in relation to engagement with the executive, if I'm being entirely candid, it's a bit like the river outside the window, and the tide has ebbed and flowed. So early on, we struggled for meaningful engagement, and Alan and I and Mark had to make the case about being at the table and being able to offer a view, remembering that how different things were and the uncertainty in those early days. As we've gone on, Alan certainly, I know personally, has invested a lot of time with various officials and working groups to make sure that our voice is heard. But at the end of the day, what we have said from the outset was we need a commission from the government so that we can adapt to policing TAL to support it. And Alan might want to touch on some of that in a minute. The issue of households, our operational assumption and emphasis is about the policing of house parties, where if there's effectively egregious breaches of the restrictions, we have been quite robust when we've turned up and we have issued fixed penalty notices and prohibition notices in those circumstances. I think like a lot of this, some of our other considerations, whether it's households, face masks, a whole raft of things, is that we've also got an eye on the long-term consequences for trust and confidence in policing and how hard we've tried to get the style right. And eventually there'll be commentary about where we've been spot on. And I suppose in other cases where we could have done things differently. And that's the sort of dynamic nature of this. The consistency piece is something we've tried hard to get right, even from the early days. And Alan has done a lot of work around this, but we do have a central coordination function, so that if you want to issue a ticket here in Belfast, or indeed one in Enniskillen or in the Northwest, you have to sort of run through the circumstances with a senior officer before the ticket is issued. And clearly every circumstance is slightly different, so you can't always apply a one-size-fits-all policy, but it's to try and make sure that as far as we can, we're fair and proportionate when we actually do the fourth E in enforcement. But there's an awful lot of detail behind this, Alan. So is there anything else you want to sort of...
I could also ask about the funding. You know, have you received, other than the PPE funding, any additional funding to assist with the officer hours and overtime?
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, Dolores. And given the public discourse in answering your question, I might just take us through some of the piece. So, you know, we talk a lot about the 4 E's. It wasn't an exclusively, and isn't an exclusively Northern Ireland situation. It is the National Police Chiefs Council's approved route of engage, explain, encourage, and enforce as the fourth option. That approach isn't just a PSNI approach. It's been agreed with this policing board, with senior political stakeholders, and a lot of the senior political messaging is around that you cannot police your way out of these situations. It has a role, but you cannot police your way to solution. And an enforcement should be a last solution, but public and civic responsibility on the front end is the most important part. And that is a cross-party, cross-executive, cross-government support for that position. And we maintain it on that basis and not unilaterally. To make sure that we have human rights compliance, proportionality, and legitimacy around this, given that they're healthcare regulations, the prioritisation of the police work is driven by a health requirement, not by me as the police gold commander. I think that's important. This is a health crisis. These are health regulations, and we respond to health's needs in trying to focus the best use of our resources. And that means that varies over time. And that first part of your question, Dolores, around collaboration, I have a very close working relationship with health, their senior advisors, their senior officials, and indeed their ministers and executive feed into that, so that we are part of that. I think that will need to change and increase going forward now that we're in an environment where localized action and localized restrictions are ebbing and flowing on a fast time basis. And I think the coordination at the strategic level will need to reflect that going forward. And this is a position I reflected to the executive office meeting that I attended this morning on behalf of the Chief Constable. And we wait to see the progress on that. In terms of the specifics, the Chief touched on our activity. A lot of the public discourse at the minute around face coverings, to take up your question, Doris, I think is almost hinting that police aren't doing anything in this space, and nothing could be further from the truth. Across the piece, in pubs, we've had about, since the pubs reopened and restrictions were imposed in various tranches, we've had about, just on the high side, 650 calls for service, most of which has been serviced. That's on top of about another 1,000 inspection visits that we've performed in the period as a service, and that has resulted in a lot of advice and guidance, but equally it has resulted in 60 prohibition notices issued to various premises, including closures. The Chief has touched on house parties and house fines. That again was prioritised by the police service because that's the request of health, and that's what the information said was the source of the public health risk. So again, a health-driven requirement. And we make no apology in responding to that, in particular some of the antisocial behaviour that we saw trailed in the media recently. Over 450 fines to date have been issued in that, another 30 odd last night. So the problem hasn't gone away. This is an ongoing daily priority for us in terms of tackling that community transmission born out of house parties with large numbers. So 450 fines to date, and I have no doubt that that will increase, with a further 104 prohibition notice on householders who have been hosting those parties. So that's a substantial amount of work. On a smaller scale, but equally important, we continue to be directed and prioritise on behalf of health enforcement around quarantine and self-isolation issues. And we've issued 20 fines, just on the high side of 20 fines in relation to that. And those are very punitive fines, £1,000 plus. So we are active in that space too, in support of the wider health regulations. But turning to the full context around the current public discourse, I wouldn't want any message to go out from me, the chief, the team, or indeed this board, that police are idle in this space. The full context of it is when the regulations changed around retail and face coverings, the executive regulations designated retail businesses to have powers to take any such steps to ensure compliance with the wearing face coverings up to but not including fixed penalty notices. So there is a role for businesses, and I'm not saying it's all their job, but there is a role, and that role for businesses is recognised within the regulations and in the statute, and obviously was considered in the making of that statute. But we stand full square with those retail businesses and trying to get that to a good place. We have, since the regulations came in, at a conservative estimate, visited 3,656 retail properties. Now, some of those will be more than once to the same place, but over 3,656 visits to shops since the regulation changed. And the principal piece of that is about visibility and support to those businesses, as we all collectively will go about trying to ensure compliance with the wearing face coverings. And the 90% estimated usage of that is a reflection, I think, of the success of that approach. And I think you'll have heard in public discourse interviews with retail representatives who are at pains to accept and applaud the partnership we've had with policing in this space. So that's a significant amount of effort by us in this space at this time. That's set against, I talked about the 650 plus complaints in relation to license premises. We've had 8 complaints from the public in relation to the public and or businesses in relation to the wearing of face coverings in shops. So you can see there's a much lower level of public complaint and a much higher level of compliance. And to put that in further context, the total number of fines issued for this retail space mass across the UK is less than 10 for the entire UK. So we're aligned and consistent in our approach. But that partnership continues. We enjoy, as recently as this morning, from senior health advisors and senior politicians across the executive, support for our position and support for our action in this place. But we're not complacent about that. I will be again picking up meetings on Monday with our retail partners in the groups and consultation groups that we've had throughout the period. And I'll be asking them further what more we can do to assist in this partnership approach going forward. So we're not idle in this space. We've done a lot of work. No fines doesn't mean no action. There's been a lot of work taken behind the scenes. The 90% piece, I think, speaks to that, as does the support we're getting from health, who at the end of the day are there to help us prioritise our actions. And I think that's all in the sound place. Chair, you mentioned communications. I raised this with the executive group this morning. The communications around this space aren't helpful to us as a service, and there seems to be a degree of mixed messaging from across a number of strands in this. I've raised this with the meeting this morning. I think there's an acknowledgement of that across the executive departments, and I've been given a reassurance that that will be addressed in the days ahead.
It didn't address, thank you very much for that, but didn't address the finance bit. And can I just, it was raised with me last night that some members of the public are buying these badges to say that they're exempt from wearing face masks, which I think have no validity. And could we be clear about that? And perhaps Alan might take that back, I mean, as I will, to the executive in terms of getting a message out. You know, I think the last thing we want to do is to scapegoat and to point the finger at people who, for very real reasons, are not wearing masks. But a lot of people, as I understand it, are buying these things off the internet, which is nothing other than a scam.
Mark.
We'll take the issue back about your last point, Dolores, just on the finance piece then. So whenever we budgeted for this year, 2021, no one had anticipation of the COVID crisis. So there was significant pressure on the budget at the start of the year, and we spent 1.1 million in overtime in April alone when we moved to 12-hour shift pattern to optimise the enforcement of the travel regulations, as Alan has outlined. We put it in your bid in to recover the monies that we'd spent on PPE and on overtime and other things, and we got a return of about 14 million, most of which has been specifically ring fenced for specific issues. We had 2 million of unallocated revenue, which we're allowed then to use to try and offset some of the overtime costs. So by the middle of the summer, we had an overtime pressure of just over 1 million against the profile, and we took 4 million out of the budget before the year started anyway. I put 500,000 back in, and then required the heads of branches to try and find the rest of it. We were back in profile, but through operation demands the last couple of months, again, we're about pressure of about 500,000 again. But we still have a little bit of of unallocated revenue, about £1.5 million, which have been holding back for wave 2, which we think is about to happen. So we have a bit of money going forward to try and help us with the resourcing piece over the next sort of 6 weeks, 8 weeks. It just depends then, Dolores, how severe the current crisis remains and whether or not we need to put in more bids at a monitoring round in the new year.
Okay, thank you very much. John, you want to ask some further questions on COVID?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And it follows on from the questions asked and the answers given. I would thank the Chief and ACC Todd for the detail provided here. But to ask a question deliberately in an effort to avoid any kind of blame culture evolving around the current discussion on response to COVID-19, I think we should begin by thanking again those involved in our retail sector and, of course, the police for their delivery as well in the early days of COVID-19 when they worked very hard, all of them, to deliver and continue to deliver a vital public service along with other frontline services. But so that we're clear on how the response is being handled and to put some detail on it, can I ask, and ACC touched on it there, what conversations are taking place with, for example, retail representative organisations, traders association, chambers of commerce, town centres, managers, and their counterparts, and is that being rolled out across all areas, or is that Belfast stroke government central? And also following on from that, is there more that we can do as a policing board to ensure that PCSPs based in local councils are doing their part in trying to get the message out locally, and could local councils also be involved in using environmental health services to work on this as well? I think the health minister is quoted as saying he would like now to see a Northern Ireland-wide approach. So the question touches on what can all of us do together to reach that point. And finally on the subject of messaging, I know Alan made frequent media appearances at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm not suggesting he spends half his day doing that again. But is there a realistic question to be asked that do we need to get back to regular messaging on this so that the public are clear what the police are doing and how it fits in with other departmental targets and executive targets as well?
There's again quite a lot there, John. I suppose I know Alan will be able to fill in. There's an awful lot of work has gone on in relation to, you touched on it in the previous question about relationships with the retail sector and the various bodies that represent businesses across the country in that space. So we'll touch on that. I think the point you make about two things, I suppose, yes, in terms of the role of other agencies, I think, to be quite candid, some others have been slow to step into the space and use the powers they've been given. As I said in my introduction, we are now seeing normal levels of work as well as this, and there are occasions where other people could support us. Now, a good example of a change in tack, frankly, is we've now got a joint enforcement team here in Belfast city centre looking at policing of restrictions. So that's to be welcomed. But Alan will have a view as well, but there's more to do. And similarly in the media space, I think that's more of a fundamental question about if this is a health issue, why is it the responsibility of the police to explain it to everybody? So I think that the issue here is, as Alan said, we're supporting a health-led endeavour, and therefore the explanation should be from the health side of the house, and we support that rather than us having to try and explain everything, because we have a whole range of other things where there's quite legitimate interest in what we're doing. But I don't think it should be our job to explain someone else's regulations. But Alan, do you want to say anything else?
Thanks, Chief. And just coming into John's and following on from the money piece, I did touch on earlier on, and the Chief said, I mean, the regrettable situation is going to be that I think there are going to be increased restrictions. I mean, our working assumption based on our advice from health and the conversations we have with health is that we're looking at some forms of restrictions of a significant level for the next 6 months. And we're looking at significant rates of infection for a similar type of period, or at least part of that as this wave comes in. And we as an organisation of 10,000 people are going to be impacted by that as well. So when we add test, trace and isolate into that, our capability is going to be under pressure at a time when our demands are also under pressure. And that's already starting to show on the finance side of that. And equally, you know, our PPE turnover has jumped as we've had to accelerate PPE provision in line with national guidance, to the point where yesterday I've now increased our working assumption that even against a high rate, our PPE usage is going to go up another 50% per week, and we've now reduced minimum stock holding to 12 weeks because we can just see this coming. So that pressure on the purchase equipment side is going to be matched by demand pressure on the demand supply side. So I think those are pressures we can inevitably see coming and which we're not funded for. John, a couple of straightforward pointed questions and just straightforward answers. We set up retailer communications group directly to myself to inform us and to inform our policing operation from pretty much week one through Ryan Feeney as our director of comms. And that encompasses large businesses, small businesses, manufacturing sector and others. There's always more we can do, John, and I actually do think that the suggestion of PCSP, even if all they do is run a local audit with their local businesses to make sure those businesses are sure they're getting an audience and a say, but I can give you an assurance as a board that all the strategic representative bodies of those manufacturing, transport, retail, small and large, all their representative bodies have direct access to me, and we have another round of calls on Monday. We tried it every 2-3 weeks. It's been a bit of a hiatus, just the way things have been. But I get feedback from them. I take their requests. We feed that directly into our planning process, and I think it's been really healthy and really constructive. And I think you hear some of that feedback and some of those representatives that were interviewed on the media over the last few days in acknowledging that as a situation. So I think I give the board that reassurance. Around about the communications piece, I mean, it's been yes, you're right. It seemed to be a regular, a daily appearance. It's not something I hanker after, particularly as an individual. I think I'm not going to that. I don't hanker after as an individual. I think when we have something to say as a service, we say it. And if we feel we have a legitimate policing purpose for doing so, we do. I have had conversations with Chief and others on an ongoing basis. I took a view and have taken a view over more recent weeks that by stepping into that space, which is, I think, rightly belongs to others, we have made an issue about policing that isn't a policing issue. And that's not a problem in and of itself, other than I think it has been counterproductive to the overall success of the policing operation and the overall impact. And that is a concern to me. So that's why we stepped back from that space. And that's why you're seeing that space, I think, filled by Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Advisor, retail representatives, senior politicians, ministers, which is, I think, where it belongs. But we keep that under constant review. I do think the public discourse in recent days has been on helpful number of fronts, and I think I'll continue to talk to the Chief, and if we collectively feel that's something we need to take some space on, and I think we'll not shrink away from doing that. But equally, I would say, because this was a conversation we had with media outlets yesterday, where we were being accused of not appearing on various shows of various, the outlets were saying we weren't engaging. We answered over 270 press queries from them in the last month, and most of those average at 6 or 7 questions. There's 1,000 questions to the organisation about what we're doing, answered the same day they're asked, to all media outlets without fear or favour, right across Northern Ireland, the island of Ireland, and indeed further afield, without any hesitation and with complete openness and transparency. So I absolutely reject the notion that we're not accounting for ourselves in the process.
Okay, thank you, Chief, and thank you to Alan for the answers to the COVID questions. I want to move into another area of questioning now, and as we've had mentioned a number of times at the board already, the clock is running down and we're getting closer and closer to EU exit. And so Colm is going to lead us in some questions in this area. Colm.
Chair, thank you very much. And Chief Constable, thank you for your report. As Duke outlined there, this day, 3 months, is New Year's Eve, and it's all over. So, I mean, it is that, it's 13 weeks, so not a lot of time to be there. And completely understand the points you make around finance, and it's not just the immediacy of the 4.5 million, and of course we will work for as hard as we can to secure that for you, but it's the longer term finance as we move beyond the 1st of January and to look at the implementation of the Ireland Northern Ireland Protocol, whatever that means, and obviously clarity on that would be extremely important. But obviously there's the potential implication on increased cross-border crime and all that goes with that. I think I'm also a bit exercised about the lack of access that we currently enjoy, and in many respects I suspect take for granted around the EU protocols, such as outlined in your report, the European arrest warrant, and all of those things. And I appreciate that Northern Ireland doesn't have a seat at the negotiating table. It's all done UK to EU. But I suppose what are we doing to make sure that the voice is heard? We are unique within the UK in terms of the pressure that will fall on this part, this corner of the UK. And a lot of those things that we take for granted are going to be really important. I know from other work that I do that other parts of government are feeding into those negotiations to ensure that the things that, for example, in food standard, the RASIF system is part of the negotiations, and no reason why access to those systems can't be maintained even in a no-deal scenario, given the import of that. So I thought some comfort about what we're doing on that. I am comforted by your reference to the establishment of a platinum group. I'm not very long on the policing board. I've only heard of that in relation to COVID, so I'm delighted to hear the seriousness with which you're taking it. But I did pick up in the media slightly worrying today that there has been, I'm aware of a cross-government group that's been established for a couple of months now. The inference in today's paper was that the PSNI have just been invited into that, which seems a little bit strange. So I'm keen to understand why it took so long for you to get a seat at that table. And I suppose if there's an issue around that, what can we as a policing board do to oil the wheels of government to give greater outcomes for the PSNI's input?
Thanks, Colm. Obviously, this is Mark's first chance to explain some of the details, so I won't hog too much of probably what should be better be his airtime. I think, obviously, in terms of the influencing piece, given the nature of work here, we rely, for example, on briefings into our host ministry so that can then feed up. So I regularly meet with the Permanent Secretary to discuss issues of concern across a range of issues, frankly, so that it can be quite sort of properly pushed into the government arena within the Northern Ireland context. And also have a regular meeting with the head of the Northern Ireland office, which in a similar way then pushes you into the space of the UK government as well. A bit like, I suppose, Alan has said in the COVID space, there's probably more to be done. And sometimes that's where we can try and push up, but equally where we're invited to be part of the discussion and at the table, which Mark can touch on. Finance, I think, is a really interesting issue because I won't steal too much of Mark's thunder, but the planning assumption that we've made in the last few weeks is effectively the border shifting from the Irish Sea back to the border itself as a land border, and that is well rehearsed in terms of a range of policing challenges. And I think that's where to actually focus on the 2nd of January would probably be a bit of a mistake. It's the long-term effects, if that's where we end up, in terms of how we preserve normality and community as well as economic life, both in Northern Ireland as a whole, but also particularly in that part of the country. And Mark has been doing a lot of thinking in that space, so I can bring him in to share that with you because it links to the broader funding question, frankly, of the 7,500 officers, because I think what you hear from communities in that part of the country, but actually neighbourhood policing and having that local trusted presence is actually part of giving people reassurance that we can manage any changes in the pattern of crime, as well as keeping the sort of free flow of traffic either side of the border as normal as possible. But do you want to share a bit more detail, Mark, just about what you are doing?
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Chair. So yes, the planning for EU exit, which I think it's 92 days now, has not only just begun, I suppose is the best way to put it here. The board will be familiar with Up Nebraskan and Operation Cookhouse, which was the longer term project management and the contingency response of PSNI to EU exit, and has been ongoing for over 2 years now. I've taken the decision to wind those up, and the collective Operation Skies, as it's now known, looks at both that short term, what does this mean on the 31st of December and into January in the first part of 2021, and then, as the Chief has mentioned, what does it mean longer term for communities across Northern Ireland, but particularly those communities living in border areas that are already feeling disconcerted, the lack of clarity as to what this means for their daily lives. Many of those communities which are coherent communities, span both sides of the land border. And so we need to understand what it is that we need to do to support them. But if I break that down a bit further, the shorter term part, which is what will happen at the ports, namely and primarily Larne, Belfast and Warren Point, but also Derry, London, Derry, come sort of the 31st of December and into the start of next year. And we work very closely with our partners in Border Force, HMRC and DERA around what that might mean in terms of compliance arrangements and the knock-on impact that we have on the transport infrastructure and indeed for commercial life and food chain, etc., for the country. And we have very good engagement with the likes of the Hauliers Association and other networks around that. We are, of course, planning. There is a lack of clarity about what those arrangements are going to be at the moment, and we are waiting for, primarily on a UK-wide basis, led by the Home Office. We're waiting to see what those arrangements are going to be, but in the meantime, we are contingency planning around that, as you would expect. And we will start now to exercise those contingency plans again with our partners. As I say, as we move into the longer term, we need to try and understand what it means in terms of compliance arrangements in other areas. So if, for example, people, the movement of people, the movement of livestock, the movement of goods between the UK and Europe, what does that mean for our border communities? Which parts of our communities are going to be disproportionately impacted economically? There is a lot of concern around the agri-food sector and what does that mean? And so when we're looking at this, we're planning for at least 1 year ahead and not simply what's going to happen in January. In terms of all those arrangements, and you've alluded to from a criminal justice point of view in terms of information sharing, European arrest warrants, and all of that, we are, as I said, there's a lack of clarity. We're waiting for those negotiations, primarily led by the Home Office and on a UK-EU basis. Around where we are plugged into that, we are very well connected and have a seat at the table in the steering group for the International Crime Coordination Centre, ourselves in Scotland, feed into that along with England and Wales, governed by the National Police Chiefs Council. So they are aware of the unique circumstances for some of our communities who, as I say, live in their lives, their daily lives on both sides of the border. We are plugged into the broader national working groups that allow us to emphasise the concerns that we have. And within the devolved administrations, we do, of course, work very closely with Department of Justice, and we feed into their readiness groups. And whilst you allude to the cross-cutting executive office meeting, we are, of course, still connected in there and do regularly feed in our concerns and what the outworkings of various agreements might mean for ourselves in policing.
Sorry. No, that's reassuring, Chief and Mark. But I suppose the final question, I'm not for an answer now, Simon. But if there's more that we as a policing board can do to sort of open doors, if you like, within the broader public sector, just let us know.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a wider area of questions now, and first one from Edgar, please.
Thank you, Chair. This question is in the context of National Hate Crime Awareness Week coming up on the 10th to 17th of October, Chief. In recent weeks, there has been a raft of media reports of serious online threats directed at MLAs, broadcasters, and indeed an executive minister. Chief Constable, are you satisfied that there is robust policing of online hate material by social media providers in the first instance, and that you have the right powers to deal with online hate and threats?
Thanks, Edgar. I think the best thing to do here is bring Mark in on this because it's one of his areas of particular interest and expertise, given not just his role here in Northern Ireland, but a UK-wide role. I think it's also worth stressing, though, for everyone's point of view, clearly the pattern that we've seen in the last few weeks of some quite horrible and odious insults on people using social media is something that is reprehensible, be it politicians, journalists, a range of people have been subject to this sort of abuse. So where we can, we will investigate and we will support people through, depending on what the nature of the threat is, because in some cases it's been quite extreme in terms of threat to their personal safety. So we will offer prudent crime prevention advice, as well as trying to find the source of where the post has come from. But I know Mark's got a lot of detail on this.
Yeah, thanks, Edgar. Yeah, and it is National Hate Crime Awareness Week coming up this month, and the first thing to say is that we all need a collective position on people using internet or any other media to spread their own personal hate toward people. It has massively impacted upon people, irrespective of whether or not it reaches a criminal threshold. We're seeing huge damage done to families and individuals around this country and other countries by what's been spread about people. There is a very fine debate here between what's criminal and what's freedom of speech. I was due today actually have a meeting with one of the internet companies alongside the Association of Chief of Police and Crime Commissioners in London around this. And we did have a conference here, as I said earlier, in the meeting in February with the community and social media providers. And not all of them turned up. Some did and some didn't, in terms of providers. The bottom line is I've never felt that there is sufficient ability in this space. The police's role is almost entirely reactive. When matters are reported to us, there is so much in the social media space that we can't actively really police it and go hunting for stuff. Therefore, we respond when people have matters referred to us. Quite often, the matters that are referred to us are more offensive than criminal, and it is unfortunate for people when they find out that actually some of the stuff that is said about them is just that offensive and doesn't necessarily reach a criminal threshold. But that varies from offence to offence and varies from the type of hate that's being spewed. The first defence to this are the social media providers. It is their rules that allow people to join. It is their rules that allow people to upload material. And it is their rules that decide whether or not people should be removed from their platforms or not. And whilst they are good at dealing with very extreme stuff, and against big organizational issues or international issues, an awful lot of this stuff is a lot lower level. It's individual to individual, or focused upon people. And we see it particularly badly with focus upon politicians and journalists, and also particularly on female politicians and journalists. And some of the stuff you see toward our female representatives here and across other parts of the UK is just crazy. And we have a monitoring tool now where we could see 60,000 messages against somebody in a matter of minutes if certain things come into the public domain, and we are able to monitor retrospectively what's happening to people, but not proactively. I do think that there would be a lot of public support for increased powers in this area. Judge Marinen's finishing his hate crime review at the minute. And one of the areas that he took on as additional part of his terms of reference to see whether or not there is a space that we can tighten up in here. But policing after the event isn't going to really fix this, Edgar. This is a societal response. I think we all have to put pressure on the providers that we pay to be a bit more aggressive in this area. And there also is a question about the amount of money that's being pushed into the public sector from the private providers or not to try and support both victims. So, I mean, there's a very roundabout answer for saying, in some respects, that no, we're not satisfied. Some providers are better than others. And I don't think this is going to be a topic that, that was going to go away for us very soon. But just to be really clear on this point, if stuff's reported to PSNI, and there's a criminal offence disclosed, we will make very robust attempts to find the perpetrator. And if they're within our jurisdiction, we will go and get them. If they're outside of our jurisdiction, then the pressures become a bit harder to do that.
How clear is the distinction between the offensive and the criminal?
Well, so, for example, it's not criminal to offend someone's religion under European law, but it may be offensive to offend your race. So it depends upon the statute that you're looking at in the Public Order Act generally. And the statutes change a little bit as you go around the UK. But so that's why there's it's quite a fine line. And then there's other commentary that might just be obscene about you, but doesn't actually breach the law. Although its pictures and so forth are attached to it, then it can breach older regulations around obscene publications and so forth. And some of the degree of obscenity will then indicate as to whether or not it can be successfully brought before a court. I mean, I think both here for the PPS and in other parts of the UK for CPS, I think they're doing as much as they can to use the current laws available to prosecute where they can. But the issue is much, much bigger than individual prosecutions of people. And it genuinely is on a case-by-case basis. And we could talk all day, but there's other issues such as bullying and so forth that go on that are a form of hate, and which don't necessarily fall inside a criminal threshold either, do affect our young people in quite a significant way, or affect the more vulnerable in our community in quite a significant way. And that's about societal norms, and what's allowed to happen is more than just about whether or not the police can prosecute the person afterwards.
Thank you. Meryvn.
Thank you, Chief, for your answers and for your report. I want to just focus in relation to Her Majesty's Inspector's report, which we have now received, and obviously it's very welcome that that report highlights that the police treats the public and its workforce fairly and respectfully, and there's a lot of good in that report. Sometimes we're very quick on this board and in other places to jump on the things which are the negative, as opposed to actually commend you and your officers for good work that's being done. One of the issues that was raised in the report was in regards to the availability and the shortage of serious crime investigators. And clearly, in the space of the 7,500 officers and the demand on the service, can you give some indication as to how that very specific issue in relation to the serious crime investigators is going to be addressed? Because sadly, as you've indicated, even in the COVID space that we're now in, we're beginning to see that space, the crimes beginning to increase, or sort of the demands on the service increasing. So can we have some indication as to whether or not that need is going to be met, and how is it going to be met, and it's inside that envelope of the 7,500 officers?
Thanks, Meryvn, and thanks for the acknowledgement that we got 3 good ratings. Sometimes it's easy to forget when you look at some of the commentary, but there's some actuals around this. The gap that's described is part of a UK-wide gap, so we're not unique in terms of a shortage of detectives. In our specifics, though, I think there are 2 issues probably that we need to look at, and it sits within the New People strategy as well, which you've seen here recently. One is broader workforce mix, so which investigative roles need absolute policing powers and experience, and which roles perhaps lend themselves to more specific support. So an example might be an investigation of cybercrime, where you might not need the whole history of police experience to help you in that space. Where we have made progress, though, in the sort of pathway from being, for example, a patrol officer to be a detective, is that we saw in the past, when officers were presenting themselves to the national examination that is the gateway to becoming an accredited detective, the pass rate was less than 30%, which was dramatically different to other parts of the UK. So what we've done is introduce something that goes back as far as my detective days, many, many years ago. We call it an investigative aid. So in a sense, you go into the investigation branch for about 6 months experience, and you sit the exam whilst there, rather than the other way around. And we've seen the pass rate now go up to nearly 80%. So that seems to be a positive step forward in terms of creating the pool of people that then go for the various layers of accreditation. So it's something we're keeping a close eye on, because even recent events, the new eye investigation being just one, shows how quickly complex investigations will consume our resources. And equally, it's a well-rehearsed argument, but the policing of the legacy issues, we've got nearly 70 people in the legacy branch, which, if that was dealt with by other means, could be put back into the main pool to investigate serious crime and terrorism.
Okay, Thank you. Gerry.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, thank you for your report. You mentioned about the Black History Month, and I wanted to return to the issue of Section 44 of the Serious Crime Act 2007. And thank you for the answer, which told me that it has been used 5 times. Black Lives Matter and the 6th of June, the protest 6th of June between Belfast and Derry. So I wanted to, if you could expand on it, and indeed has it been used since? I suppose more specific to the north of Ireland, but if you want to expand out beyond that, that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that was obviously an operational decision made at the time through Alan, his command of that particular operation. We can check the detail, Gerry, because this is a broad piece. I was aware that at one point the Metropolitan Police were looking to use the same legislation for similar reasons, but then changed their tack a few weeks ago. I think it was in relation to policing one of the central London protests. I'm not aware that we've used that legislation since, but I'll check with Alan. Have we done it since then? No. But we can try and get a brief if there's any other examples for you.
Okay, that's very helpful. And I'm just wondering then, has a decision been made? It's not the lack of use of the Serious Crime Act if there is serious crime. I mean, the issue here is this was for cautions and for possible fines is what the issue was, and unfortunately it was all of those 2 protests. So has a decision been made, or is this an operational issue every time an issue comes up? Has a decision been made that it won't be used in, for instance, peaceful protests, which might not be Black Lives Matter, might be a number of other protests?
You can never rule out anything because you're not quite sure of the circumstances. So I wouldn't want to become a hostage to fortune. But the crux of this was effectively it was the only enabling legislation we had to do with the organisation of a protest in the context of the COVID environment. And that was why we used that legislation on advice.
Okay, thank you. Trevor.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose it's actually it's interesting in terms of the point that Gerry has raised. But I think we sometimes, Chair, get in the danger we actually tie the police's hands. I mean, I think given there were unique circumstances in relation to those 2 events, I think we stray in the danger of tying people's hands in relation to that. But anyway, my question I was going to ask around social media, and it has been raised earlier in the private session. So I take your guidance in relation to not going into that area changed. Now, we do know of incidents where maybe some jokes maybe went too far, but I fear that the change has made that the engagement may disappear. And if it sticks to that very basic stuff, that you won't get that communication with the police, or sorry, with the police, with a particular strategy in relation to that, or can we see something going back to business as usual in terms of how that business is done? Because it has been a very useful tool, and people have commented on it about how useful it has been in terms right down to simple operations within the area, whether it's speed checks from our neighbourhoods, officers, or other things, which gives that confidence in the police, and they actually can see, because police may be criticised often but not been visible, but I think Facebook addressed that.
Thanks, Trevor. A really interesting question, actually, because we touched on a few times about investment in neighbourhood policing, and obviously I think part of the success of neighbourhood policing is to show understanding and ownership of local problems, and clearly not every occasion does someone anymore walk into a police station to either tell us something or find things. So having that reach, I think, is really important. What we've tried to do, frankly, and everyone will have a different view on this, is professionalise how we use social media. I know some people have not taken kindly to the reduction in access to social media accounts, which I think was at one stage about 400 people. It's now dropped quite considerably. But I think the issue we were trying to face, and you touched upon it, is, if I'm honest, on occasions, we've probably overtried in being too familiar and too humorous, and that's backfired on us on occasions quite spectacularly so. Now, in the broader terms, when you're policing what is effectively a small town of 10,000 people, people will make mistakes, and it's how we deal with that. But what we've been doing in recent times is a few things. Firstly, we're not there yet, because we recognise how important digital communication is going forwards. But we are building a bigger and better digital hub, for want of a better word, which will be based in our communications branch to actually manage some of the platforms, be it Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And I think part of the route forward is with properly trained people.
And to frame that differently, can I appeal then that you do continue to review this? Because I think, and I'm sure you'll accept that where you have used it for missing persons in particular, the amount of people who share that and the results that you actually get on the back of that, and how quickly some of that stuff is addressed, I think it's been very useful, and it's very. I would ask you to continue to keep it under review.
Yeah, and absolutely, we will. You know, I'm a keen advocate of that sort of communication itself, because I think it's instant. It gives an insight into what we're doing, and if done well, it's not just. I mean, you make a really good point about returning missing people to safety quickly, but there's a whole host of other things, be it crime rules, giving information in live incidents. We wouldn't want to see that we have no presence, and actually, sometimes Alan gave a very powerful statistic on the number of inquiries every day. We, for example, in relation to the policing of the COVID issues, if we push out more of our own content, it helps manage that so that we can concentrate precious resource on other things. So I would probably anticipate there'll be a bit like a curve where we've come down to actually standardise and set standards. And as we invest in neighbourhood policing in the next 12 months or so, we'd like to see how we get the balance right between local and central accounts.
Thank you very much. Final question I've been notified of is Seán's. So pass over to Seán. Is anybody else with a burning issue wave at me? No. Thank you, Seán.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Back to the HMIC report, Chief. Acknowledging the positives, but one of the key criticisms was the report of use of force. So my question is, what steps will you take to ensure that all use of force by all officers are recorded?
Thank you. Well, it is one of those areas, as you say, Seán, in the report, which shows where we could do better. We took this really seriously when both Mark and I and others received the report, even in draft form from HMI. And we tried to triangulate the findings because we frankly do produce an awful lot of data on use of force, which is actually on our website as well. So we were quite surprised initially. I think where we assess at the moment is in terms of reassurance that where records haven't been completed, it's at the very lower end, for example, the purpose of a search, but not arresting them. Other of where force have been used where there wasn't a form filled. So in terms of moving forwards, what we're doing is trying to see how we can automate when an officer has used force, for example, from custody to the recording of force system, so that the room fare is not there. And similarly, how we integrate it better into the performance framework, which we've touched on a few times in different meetings that Mark is beaving away at the moment to bring to life. So it is a confidence issue. I entirely accept that. And we need to work out how we get pretty much 100% compliance with the requirement to record when we've used force.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who has taken part. Thank you to those who have joined us online, but particularly thanks to Simon and the team from PSNI. We look forward to going through all of this again on the Thursday, the 5th of November, which remember the 5th of November. It should be one we can recall for the next meeting here. And now I'll go out there and enjoy the beautiful weather, which we seem to be getting now. So thank you very much indeed.